Hi, I'm Mark Merritt, and today I'm going to talk about how to get an 800 on the SAT subject test Math 2. The first time I took the Math 2 test, I scored a 660, and a year later, this month, I scored an 800. I learned a lot about test prep in general as I prepared for this test, and I made a lot of mistakes both as I was preparing the first time and as I was preparing the second time. After the scores came out and I was on the College Board website looking at my score, I got that crushing feeling that I think just about every Ivy League hopeful gets at some point in their studies. But it really wasn't such a big deal. One of my major mistakes while preparing for the test the first time was using the wrong material, or at least material that was insufficient on its own. I've learned math on Khan Academy for years, and it has really good stuff, but it's not enough to prepare you for the Math 2 test because most of its questions are pretty straightforward, and the Math 2 test tries to trick you. The test tries to ask unfamiliar kinds of questions for familiar content. A perfect example is this question. For this question, you're given the graphs of two functions, f of x and g of x, and you're asked, what will the graph of the product of these two functions look like? If you want to try this question out on your own, go ahead and pause the video now. Okay, so what you do is you look at the signs of the functions when x is negative and when x is positive. So for f of x, when x is negative, f of x is also negative. When x is positive, f of x is positive. And for g of x, when x is positive, g of x is positive, and when x is negative, g of x is negative. So when x is negative, both functions are negative. And so if we take g of x times f of x for any x that is negative, we're going to get a positive value. Because when you take a negative value times a negative value, you get a positive value. And you also get a positive value whenever x is positive, because for all x greater than 0, g of x is greater than 0, and f of x is greater than or equal to 0. So you take a positive value, you multiply it by a positive value, you get a positive value. And so the answer to the question is B. If you got it right, great, and if you got it wrong, it's alright. I showed you that question just to give you an idea of the kind of problems that you're going to see in the Math 2 test. And that definitely doesn't represent the difficulty of all of them, by the way. The first 20 or so questions are fairly easy and you can solve them in, if you're good, under a minute for sure. Aside from the fact that I was over-relying on Khan Academy, I was also prioritizing the wrong material. When I was preparing for the test the first time, I focused on pre-calculus because that was an obvious weakness. I only had 70% of the Khan Academy playlist done, and even though I knew the pre-calculus concepts, at least somewhat, I knew I wasn't comfortable enough with them to solve questions in under a minute or under even 2 minutes. However, pre-calculus isn't nearly as important for the test as geometry is. Don't get me wrong, pre-calculus isn't insignificant, but geometry questions tend to make up about a third of the test. And even though I knew all of the geometry content on Khan Academy, my skills were definitely rusty. I could have done far better on my first try if I'd focused on geometry instead of pre-calculus. Now is probably a good time to note that I had about a month and a half to prepare the first time, and the second time I gave myself a lot more time, maybe 4 months. And this might sound like the obvious reason why I had a score disparity, but I think it was a lot more about focusing on the right material and having a better strategy. Because the first time I took the test, I really had no strategy. I had no idea what the hell I was doing, really. I missed 15 questions, and when I got about halfway through the test and then saw the next few questions, I thought, I'm screwed. I proceeded to spend about the entirety of the rest of the test trying to figure out how to solve those following questions. The way I prepared for the tricky questions was with the Princeton Review prep book, and I'm not sure how I really could have gotten used to those questions without the book. And it has some nifty tricks on how to improve your speed with certain types of questions. They're the kind of tricks that really don't help you learn anything new about math, but they're just useful for a test. I typically read prep books cover to cover, but I didn't in this case because Khan Academy teaches you everything you need to know, except for the kinds of questions that are going to be testing your knowledge of those concepts. So that's where your prep book comes in. If you're planning on buying the Princeton Review prep book though, you should note that the first 2 practice tests are extremely similar to 2 practice tests in the official College Board practice test book. So only buy the College Board book if you need more practice tests after you're done with all of them from the Princeton Review book. Make sure not to waste your practice tests like I did. My math ego couldn't handle it when I got a low score on a practice test, and then the very next day I took another practice test without fully understanding all of the mistakes I made the first time. Don't do that. Awful idea. Some of the best test prep advice I've seen is from the founder of Prep Scholar, and in an article on how to get a perfect score on the SAT, he talks about how you need to constantly work on your weaknesses. Once you realize you have a weakness, you shouldn't be satisfied with just knowing that it's a problem with your geometry or your algebra. You need to go one level deeper. You should find out exactly what kind of question you're missing, because the chances are that if you're bad at, say, statistics, then there's probably a type of question that you're worse at than others, so you really need to find out what that one is, and then work on that first before everything else. Let's stick with the statistics example and say that you're getting a lot of statistics questions wrong. Try to find the question's commonalities. Maybe most of the questions you get wrong are about standard deviation, and then when you dig deeper you find that when you were doing the question, you were trying to guesstimate it, and you're bad at guesstimating a standard deviation. By the way, the standard deviation questions typically don't require a calculator. A lot of the questions are like this. It'll ask which of the following have the lowest standard deviation, and then it'll give you for answer choices lists of numbers. And a lot of the time it's going to be pretty obvious which one has the lowest standard deviation. You pick the one that has the same number repeating. Make sure to prioritize your most important weaknesses. By that I mean if one weakness is related to content that shows up much more frequently, you need to focus on that one first. So for example, if you're bad at geometry and you're bad at statistics, you really need to focus on your geometry first. In almost every practice test, I got a question wrong, not because I didn't know how to solve it, but because I rushed to read the question and then I missed a key word that completely messed up my calculations. And I did this over and over and over again. On a practice test, I scored a 740 2 weeks before I took the test, and then 1 week before the test, I scored a 770. All of my mistakes from those 2 practice tests were from a lack of close reading. You gotta read closely, that's just a must. Even though it's a math test, your reading comprehension really matters here. Possibly because I learned math on my own, I'm pretty proud of my ability to break down a problem with reasoning and figure out how to solve it on my own, which got me into a lot of trouble in my first test and in all of my practice tests, all 7 of them. So if you want to get a perfect score on this test, you have to understand that it wants you to prioritize being correct over answering as many questions as you can. So this means skipping some questions that you know are going to take you a while or you just don't know how to solve. This is what I did when I took the test the second time. I saw 2 questions that I had a faint idea of how to solve, but I wasn't sure that I could do so quickly. So when I had spare time after I finished all the other questions, instead of going and trying to answer those 2 unanswered questions, I just reviewed the things I'd bubbled in already. You need the ability to tell when you're spending too much time on a question and that you just need to abandon it right now and move on to what you can answer more quickly. You can develop this ability by taking a lot of practice tests. You could probably pace yourself by using a watch or a clock, but I found that doing so kills my focus. The first time I took the test, I was constantly looking at my watch. The second time, I didn't look at it once. The test is pretty generous with its scoring, which is why you see such a high percentage of test takers with 800s. In most versions of a Math 2 test, you can miss about 5 or 6 questions and still get an 800. And in the College Board Book of Practice Tests, which is composed of previously administered tests, you can miss 10 questions in one of the tests and still get an 800. A lot of the questions in the Math 2 test can be answered in very similar ways. I found that the 2 most common ways of solving them are with systems of equations and with ratios. Another thing that I noticed is that whenever the test throws at you a question related to proofs, like disprove this hypothesis, or prove this hypothesis, or which of these following hypotheses are accurate, then you want to use for proof by contradiction, and for disproof, for not proving things. For the opposite, you want to use the counterexample. I figured out when and when not to use the calculator just by taking practice tests and getting the feel for it by experience. So I've never really thought about the guidelines for when and when not to use a calculator. If you're not used to the most common functions of the calculator that you're going to be using in the Math 2 test, you should really spend some time getting used to them. And by this I don't mean that you should be doing problems with your calculator, I mean picking up your calculator and just punching in numbers, whatever comes to mind. So let's take the sine of 53 and then let's switch the mode really quickly to radians, and then take the sine of 53 radians. Just do whatever and get used to your calculator. To end the video, here are some general study tips that I found useful when preparing for the Math 2 test. The first is avoiding multitasking. In 2009, Stanford researchers published a paper called Cognitive Control in Media Multitaskers. The researchers conducted a series of experiments to determine whether there are systematic differences in information processing styles between chronically heavy and light media multitaskers. Results showed that heavy media multitaskers are more susceptible to interference from irrelevant environmental stimuli and from irrelevant representations in memory. This led to the surprising result that heavy media multitaskers performed worse on a test of task switching ability, likely due to reduced ability to filter out interference from the irrelevant task set. The next tip is to meditate. In 2013, researchers from the University of California, Santa Barbara published a report saying that mindfulness training improves working memory capacity and GRE performance while reducing mind wandering. In a randomized controlled investigation, we examined whether a 2-week mindfulness training course would decrease mind wandering and improve cognitive performance. Mindfulness training improved both GRE reading comprehension scores and working memory capacity, while simultaneously reducing the occurrence of distracting thoughts during completion of the GRE and the measure of working memory. Finally, do deep work. Deep work is a pretty popular idea, so I won't spend too much time on it. It's basically the idea that for productivity, it's best to be in a state of distraction-free concentration. So that means you shouldn't be checking your phone every 10 seconds, and you definitely don't want a TV on in the background. I'll include the links to the research papers in the description down below, as well as some useful links for preparing for the test. That's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something from it.